3 months passed in the Valorth settlement, and Minho Kang transformed from a wounded stranger into something no one had expected. He learned there. Language first, because communication was essential for survival. The sounds were difficult for his human throat to produce, but he practiced every day until he could hold basic conversations with the villagers around him. Cathari helped him with his pronunciation during the evenings, sitting beside him on the platform outside her dwelling while her children played nearby. The work they gave him was hard and often humiliating at first. He carried water and gathered food and cleaned the communal areas, tasks that the Valorth considered beneath their warriors, but Minho never complained and never stopped working. And slowly the people around him began to notice his dedication. His breakthrough came when one of the village storage structures began to collapse after a storm damaged its supports. The Valorth builders were struggling to repair it using their traditional methods, and Minho approached them with an idea based on human engineering principles. They were skeptical at first, but desperation made them willing to listen. His solution worked better than anyone expected. And suddenly the human who carried water was being asked for advice on construction and repairs. Word spread through the settlement about the human's strange knowledge, and other villagers came to him with problems that their traditional methods could not solve. He taught them techniques for preserving food that lasted longer than their current methods. He showed them how to create simple tools that made their daily work easier. He shared everything he knew without asking for anything in return, and the suspicion in people's eyes slowly transformed into something warmer. Cathari's children became his constant companions during those months. They followed him everywhere he went, chattering at him in their mix of baby speech and new words they were learning. The older two called him by a Valorth title that roughly translated to guardian, but the youngest one had created a special name just for him, Little Shadow, as Minho privately called the smallest child. Refused to sleep unless Minho was nearby. The little one would climb into his lap every evening and press against his chest, listening to his heartbeat until sleep came. Cathari watched this bond develop with complex emotions swirling in her heart. She had never imagined that a human could be so gentle with her children. She had never imagined that a human could fit so naturally into her family's daily rhythms, and she had never imagined that she would find herself watching for him throughout the day, feeling a warmth in her chest whenever their eyes met. The other mothers in the settlement noticed the change in her before she admitted it to herself. They teased her gently about her human, about the way she smiled when he was near, and the way she found excuses to touch his hand or his arm. Cathari denied their suggestions at first, but denial became harder as the weeks passed. She began to realize that somewhere between the jungle and now, her gratitude had transformed into something deeper. Minho was not blind to what was happening between them. He saw how Cathari looked at him, and he felt his own heart responding in ways he had not experienced in many years. But he was cautious, because their situations were complicated and their peoples had such difficult history. He did not want to presume anything or create problems for her with her community, so they circled each other carefully, sharing glances and small touches and conversations that lasted longer than necessary. The other villagers watched this dance with amusement and growing acceptance. Even Elder Voroth had softened toward the human over time, though he would never admit it publicly. Then the human ships appeared in the sky. Minho's emergency beacon had finally been detected, and a rescue team had been dispatched to recover what they expected to be either a survivor or a body. The ships landed at the edge of the settlement, and armed humans emerged to find their missing sergeant living peacefully among the Valorth. The rescue team leader was a captain named Yoon, and her confusion was obvious as she took in the scene before her. Sergeant Kang, she said slowly, We have been searching for you for months, and the convoy reported you dead after the pirate attack. Minho stood before her with Cathari beside him and 3 Valorith children clinging to his legs, as you can see. Captain, he replied, the reports were premature. Captain Yoon looked at the Valorith watching from the edges of the clearing, at the dwelling where Minho clearly lived, at the obvious bonds between him and the alien family at his side. We have transport ready, she said. You can come home now. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Minho looked at the ships that would carry him back to human space, back to his military career, back to everything he had known before the crash. Then he looked at Cathari, whose eyes held a question she was afraid to ask. He looked at the 3 children who had captured his heart during one long night in the jungle. He looked at the settlement, where he had built a place for himself against all odds. Captain, he said finally, I appreciate the rescue effort, but I will not be returning with you. Yoon's eyebrows rose in shock. Sergeant, you cannot be serious. I am completely serious, Minho replied. I have a life here, a family, and I am not leaving them. Cathari's hand found his and squeezed tightly, and he heard her breath catch with emotion. You would stay, she whispered in her own language. You would choose us. Minho turned to face her fully, ignoring the confused humans watching them. I was supposed to be rescued, he said. But I found something better than rescue. I found a home. Cathari's eyes filled with tears as she reached up to touch his face with her free hand. Then I claim you, she said, her voice clear and strong so that everyone could hear. By the old laws and the new, I claim you as mine. You protected my young. You became part of my family, and now you will stay with me forever. The Valorith watching from the edges began to cheer and call out blessings in their language. Captain Yoon and her team stood in bewildered silence as they witnessed something unprecedented unfolding before them. Minho smiled and pressed his forehead against Cathari's in the Valorith gesture of deep affection. I accept your claim, he said. The smallest child chirped loudly and climbed up Minho's back to perch on his shoulder, wrapping tiny arms around his neck. The other 2 children joined in, creating a pile of fur and laughter that made even the stern Elder Vorith crack a small smile. Captain Yoon eventually departed with her team, carrying a report that would cause considerable discussion among human diplomats for years to come. But Minho did not care about politics or diplomacy or what anyone else thought that evening. He sat outside his dwelling as the sun set over the jungle canopy. Little shadows slept in his lap, soft fur warm against his skin. The other 2 children played nearby, their happy sounds filling the air, and Cathari sat beside him, her shoulder pressed against his as they watched the colors paint the sky. Neither of them spoke, because words were not necessary. He had crashed on this moon expecting death. Instead, he had found life in its fullest and most unexpected form. The Valorith mother had kept him, and he had never felt more grateful to be kept. The Valorith settlement appeared through the trees like something from a dream, with structures built into the massive trunks and connected by bridges that swayed gently in the wind. Hundreds of Valorith moved through this hidden village, their silver and blue and gray fur catching the sunlight that filtered through the canopy. Above, Minho had never seen anything like it, and under different circumstances, he might have appreciated the beauty of what these people had built. But the moment he stepped into the clearing at the settlement's edge, everything changed. The Valorith nearest to them stopped what they were doing and stared. Then they began to shout. Word spread through the village like fire through dry grass, and within minutes, a crowd had gathered around Cathari and her human companion. Minho heard their voices rising in anger and confusion, and though he could not understand their language, he could read the hostility in their postures and their bared claws. Cathari's children pressed close to him, frightened by the commotion, and he instinctively put his hands on their small shoulders to comfort them. That simple gesture caused the crowd to grow even more agitated. Several large Valorous males pushed forward with murder in their eyes. And Minho prepared himself for a fight he knew he could not win, but Cathari stepped between him and the crowd. Her voice cutting through the noise like a blade through cloth, she spoke rapidly in her own language. Gesturing toward him and toward her children and toward the jungle behind them, the crowd listened, but their anger did not fade. An elderly Valorous male pushed through the front of the gathering, his fur gray with age and his eyes sharp with intelligence. He wore ornaments that marked him as someone important. And when he spoke, the others fell silent. Cathari, he said in universal standards so that Minho could understand. You bring a human into our sacred home, and you expect us to simply accept this. Elder Vorath, Cathari replied. I bring a human who saved my children, and I expect you to honor the old laws. The elder's eyes narrowed. Tell us what happened. He demanded. Cathari told them everything. She described finding the human at her burrow entrance, covered in blood and surrounded by dead predators. She described the evidence of his long night of fighting, the wounds he had taken in defense of her young. She described her children's reaction to him, the way they trusted him and clung to him like he was family when she finished. The crowd was quieter, but still hostile. Elder Vorath studied Minho with cold eyes. Perhaps he only killed the predators because they threatened him as well, the elder suggested. Perhaps his protection of the young was merely a coincidence. Another elder stepped forward, a female with dark blue fur and kind eyes. Elder Sena. Vorath acknowledged her with a nod. I have listened to Cathari's account, Sena said, and I believe there was no coincidence in what this human did. She turned to address the crowd. He could have fled at any time, she pointed out. His ship crashed far from the burrow, and nothing forced him to stay and fight. But he chose to protect our young, chose to bleed for them, chose to risk death for children who were not his kind. The crowd murmured, and Minho sensed some of them beginning to waver. But Elder Vorath was not convinced. Humans are treacherous, he declared. They smile while they plan betrayal, and they speak kindness while they prepare violence. This one may have saved the children, but we cannot know his true motives. Sena shook her head. The old laws do not require us to know motives, she said. They require us to honor debts, and this human has created a debt whether we like it or not. The argument continued, with the elders debating back and forth. While the crowd watched and listened, Minho stood silent through all of it, knowing that his fate was being decided and that nothing he said would matter unless someone asked him to speak. Finally, Elder Vorath turned to him with challenge in his eyes. Human, he said, you have heard our arguments, and now I will ask you directly. Why did you do what you did? Minho met the elder's gaze without fear. Where I come from, he said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. You do not leave children to die. And it does not matter whose children they are, or what species they belong to, or whether their people hate your kind. He paused and looked around at the gathered Valorous. I heard them crying in the darkness, he continued. I saw how small they were and how afraid, and I knew that predators were coming for them. So I stayed because walking away would have made me something I refused to be. The crowd was silent now, and Minho felt the weight of their attention pressing down on him. I did not do this to earn your trust or your friendship, he said. I did not do this expecting any reward or even expecting to survive. I did it because protecting the helpless is what good people do. A sound cut through the silence, and Minho turned to see a female Valorous in the crowd with tears streaming down her face. She was clutching a small toy in her hands, the kind of toy a child might play with. I lost my young one to predators 3 seasons ago, she said, her voice breaking. No one was there to protect her. No one stayed through the night to keep her safe. She looked at Minho with eyes full of grief and gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for being what I wish someone had been for my child." The mood of the crowd shifted dramatically after that other mothers stepped forward, looking at Minho with new eyes as they imagined their own children alone and afraid in the jungle. They looked at Ketheri's young ones still pressing close to him, clearly showing their trust and affection. Elder Vorath saw the change in his people and knew that the debate was over. "The council will make a formal ruling," he announced. "But I can already see which way the wind is blowing." He looked at Minho with something that might have been respect buried beneath the suspicion. "You will remain in the settlement until your debt is repaid in our way," he declared. "You will live among us and work among us and prove yourself worthy of the mercy we show you. Or you will die if you cannot adapt." Minho nodded his acceptance. Kethari took his hand again and led him away from the crowd, toward a dwelling built into one of the massive trees. Her children chirped happily and followed along, the smallest one climbing up Minho's leg until he lifted the little creature into his arms. "Welcome to your new home," Kethari said, "for however long you choose to stay." Minho looked at the settlement around him, at the alien people who had just decided to spare his life, at the mother who had brought him here and the children who had adopted him into their hearts. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time since his ship had fallen from the sky, he felt like he might actually survive this. The Valorith mother stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, her silver-blue fur bristling and her claws fully extended as she stared at the human before her children's burrow. Her name was Kethari, and she had been hunting for 2 days in the deep jungle when a flash flood had separated her from the path back to her young. She had fought through swollen rivers and treacherous terrain to return to them, driven by a mother's terror that something might have happened while she was away. Now she stood looking at her worst nightmare made real, a human. One of the strange two-legged creatures her people had warned about for generations, standing over her babies with blood covering his body. Every instinct in her screamed to attack, to tear this intruder apart and rescue her children from whatever terrible fate he had planned for them. But something made her hesitate. Her young ones were not cowering in fear or crying for her to save them. Instead, they were chirping happily and climbing over the human's legs, pressing against him like he was a member of their own family. And then there was the blood. Kethari had excellent eyes, and she could see that the blood covering the human was not her children's blood. She could also see the dead predators scattered around the clearing, massive creatures that would have torn her babies apart if they had reached them. The human watched her with steady eyes that held no fear and no aggression. He had set down his weapon and raised his empty hands, making himself vulnerable in a gesture of surrender. Kethari moved forward slowly, her body tense and ready to strike at the first sign of threat. She circled the human, sniffing the air around him and reading his body language, the way her people had done for thousands of generations. Valorith were expert hunters and trackers, able to sense fear and deception and hostile intent through subtle cues that other species could not detect. In this human, she found exhaustion and pain, and a deep weariness that came from fighting through the night. But she did not find any of the things she expected to find. There was no fear of her despite her obvious ability to kill him. There was no deception or hidden agenda in his posture. There was no hostility or threat in his scent. Instead, she found something she had never expected to find in a human. She found protectiveness, the same fierce love that drove her own kind to die for their young. She found determination, the stubborn refusal to abandon the helpless, even when facing certain death. And she found kindness, a warmth that her children had clearly recognized and responded to during their time alone with him. Kethari stopped circling and stood before the human, looking down at him from her greater height. He looked back at her without flinching, and she respected his courage, even as she struggled to understand his actions. "Why?" she asked in broken universal standard. the trade language that most species in the galaxy could speak the single word carried. All of her confusion and suspicion. Why would a human risk his life for Valorath? Young, why would he stand and fight through the night instead of running away? Why was he still here when he could have left at any time? The human took a moment before answering, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and steady despite his obvious injuries. They were alone, he said simply. They were afraid, and there were predators nearby, and I could not leave them to die. Kithari felt her fur smooth down slightly as she processed his words. You know what they are, she said. You know what I am, what my people think of humans. He nodded slowly. I know, he admitted. I know this will probably cause problems for both of us. But I could not walk away and let babies die just because they were not my kind. Her youngest child, the smallest of her three, had climbed up the human's leg and was now clinging to his arm and chirping at her. The little one was trying to tell her something in the wordless language of the very young, trying to explain that this strange creature was safe and good and should not be hurt. Kithari reached out and touched her child's head gently, and the little one chirped happily at her touch before pressing closer to the human. She looked at this strange scene before her and felt something shift inside her heart. Her people had taught her to hate and fear humans, had filled her with stories of their cruelty and their violence, and their treacherous nature, that this human had bled for her children. He had fought through the night to protect them. He had offered them warmth and food and comfort when they were alone and afraid. No story she had ever been told could explain what she was seeing now. What is your name? She asked. Minho, he said. Minho Kang. Minho, she repeated, testing the strange sounds on her tongue. I am Kithari. She made her decision in that moment. A decision that would change both of their lives forever. You protected my young, she said. By the old laws of my people, you have earned a debt that must be repaid. Minho shook his head slowly. I do not want payment for doing what was right, he said. But Kithari was not offering payment. She was offering something far more significant. You will come with me, she told him, to my settlement, to my people, and you will remain until the debt is satisfied in the Valorath way. Minho looked at her with confusion in his eyes. I do not understand, he said. Kithari reached down and took his hand in her larger one, her claws carefully retracted so she would not cut his skin. You saved my children, she said. You are part of this now, whether you wanted to be or not. She led him away from the burrow and deeper into the jungle, toward the hidden settlement where her people lived. Her three young ones followed along, chirping and tumbling over each other in their excitement to have both their mother and their new human friend together. Minho walked beside her in silence, too tired and too wounded to argue or ask questions. He had no idea what awaited him at the Valorath settlement. He had no idea what the Valorath way of repaying debts might involve. All he knew was that he had made a choice last night to protect three helpless babies. And now that choice was carrying him toward a future he could never have imagined. Kithari glanced at him as they walked, studying his profile and noting the way he moved despite his injuries. He was weaker than her people in almost every physical way, smaller and slower and more fragile, but he had stood his ground against predators that would have sent many Valorath warriors running. He had chosen to protect instead of flee, to fight instead of surrender. Perhaps, she thought, her people had been wrong about humans all along. Perhaps there was more to these strange creatures than hatred and fear had allowed them to see. She tightened her grip on his hand slightly, a gesture of reassurance that she hoped he would understand whatever happened next. She would make sure he was treated fairly. He had earned that much and more. The pulse rifle kicked against his shoulder as Minho fired 3 rapid shots into the charging predator. and bright flashes of energy lit up the darkness like lightning strikes. The creature roared in pain and fury, but did not stop coming, its massive body absorbing the damage as it lunged toward him with those terrible jaws spread wide. Minho threw himself to the side at the last moment, rolling across the jungle floor as those teeth snapped shut where his head had been just a heartbeat before. He came up firing again, this time aiming for the creature's legs in an attempt to slow it down. One shot connected with the front left limb and the predator stumbled, giving Minho precious seconds to put distance between them. Behind him, the young ones in the burrow were screaming in terror, their high-pitched cries cutting through the night air. The sound seemed to enrage the predator even further, and it turned toward the burrow entrance with hunger burning in its eyes. Minho did not think about his own safety in that moment. He simply moved, putting himself directly in the path between the creature and the helpless babies it wanted to devour. The predator charged again, and Minho met it head-on, firing until his power cell ran dry and then drawing his sidearm in one smooth motion. The creature slammed into him before he could get a shot off, and the impact sent him flying backward into the hillside with bone-jarring force. Pain exploded through his ribs, and his vision went white for a terrible moment, but he held on to his sidearm, and he did not lose consciousness. And when the predator loomed over him with blood dripping from its wounds, he shoved the barrel against its throat and pulled the trigger. The shot tore through the creature's neck, and it let out a gurgling roar before collapsing on top of him. Minho lay there for a long moment, struggling to breathe under the weight of the dead predator as hot blood soaked into his uniform. He pushed and squirmed until he finally managed to drag himself free. And then he simply lay on the jungle floor, gasping for air. His ribs were definitely cracked, maybe broken, and his entire body felt like one massive bruise. But he was alive, and the young ones were safe. He forced himself to sit up and check his weapons, finding that his rifle had 2 power cells remaining, and his sidearm was down to its last charge. Not good, but not hopeless either. He dragged the predator's body away from the burrow entrance and returned to his position, settling back against the hillside with a groan of pain. The young ones had gone silent during the fight, but now he could hear them moving around. In the darkness of their burrow, he did not look at them or try to interact with them because he did not want to frighten them any further. Instead, he simply sat there bleeding and hurting, keeping watch over creatures that were not his kind and had no reason to trust him. The night grew colder as the hours passed, and Minho found himself shivering despite the humid jungle air. Blood loss was probably contributing to that. Along with the shock of combat and the damage to his body, he chewed on a nutrient bar from his rations and tried to stay alert, knowing that the dead predator's blood would likely attract other hungry creatures. Before long, around midnight by his internal clock, he heard small sounds behind him and felt something brush against his back. He held perfectly still as one of the young ones crept out of the burrow and pressed itself against him, seeking warmth from his body. The little creature was trembling with cold and fear, its soft fur damp from the humidity inside the burrow. Minho slowly reached into his pack and pulled out his emergency blanket, a thin sheet of reflective material designed to retain body heat. He draped it gently over the young one without making any sudden movements, and the little thing let out a soft chirp of surprise before burrowing deeper into the warmth. A few minutes later, the second young one emerged and joined its sibling beneath the blanket, and then came the third, the smallest of them all, who climbed right into Minho's lap and curled up against his stomach like it belonged there. He sat there in the darkness with 3 alien babies pressed against him, and something inside his chest that had been cold for a very long time began to feel warm again. He thought about his grandmother and the stories she used to tell him about their ancestors on Earth, people who had survived wars and famines and disasters by helping each other through the darkness. She had always said that kindness was not weakness. That protecting the innocent was what separated good people from monsters. Minho had believed those words when he was young, but years of military service had hardened him in ways he did not like to think about tonight. Sitting in an alien jungle with 3 helpless babies depending on him, he remembered who he used to be. The rest of the night brought more dangers as he had expected. 2 more predators came to investigate the blood scent. Smaller than the first, but still deadly enough to kill him in his weakened state. He fought them off with careful shots, conserving ammunition while making each round count. By the time dawn began to lighten the sky, he had 3 shots left in his rifle and none in his sidearm. The young ones had slept through most of the fighting, exhausted from their ordeal and comforted by his presence. The smallest one, the one in his lap, had not moved all night except to press closer when the sounds of battle frightened. Yet Minho looked down at the little creature and felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. He would die before he led anything hurt these babies. As the morning light grew stronger, he heard something new approaching through the jungle. It was not a predator, because predators moved with stealth or confidence. And this sound was different. This was something walking upright on 2 legs, moving quickly but carefully through the undergrowth. The young ones stirred awake and began to chirp and cry. But these were not sounds of fear. These were sounds of recognition and joy and desperate hope. Minho's blood went cold as he realized what that meant. Their mother had returned. He slowly set the smallest young one aside and rose to his feet, his damaged body screaming in protest at the movement. He held his rifle loosely at his side, not pointing it at anything but not putting it down either. The vegetation parted and she emerged into the small clearing before the burrow. She stood over 2 meters tall, her body covered in silver blue fur but seemed to shimmer in the early morning light. Her limbs were powerful and her claws were extended, and her eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his heart skip several beats. She was beautiful and terrifying and clearly ready to kill him where he stood. The Valorith mother looked at the human standing before her. Children's burrow. She looked at the blood covering his body and the wounds marking his flesh. She looked at the dead predators scattered around the area, and then she looked at her 3 young ones, who were chirping and crying and trying to climb up his legs to reach him. Minho carefully set down his rifle and raised his empty hands. He did not run and he did not beg. He simply stood there and waited for her judgment. The ship screamed as it tore through the atmosphere of the jungle moon, and Sergeant Minho Kang gripped the controls with white knuckles as alarms blared all around him. He had been part of a cargo convoy moving supplies through the Viller system when the pirates had appeared from nowhere. And within minutes, his escort ships had been reduced to burning wreckage floating in the void of space. His own vessel had taken 3 direct hits before he managed to break away. But the damage was catastrophic, and his engines were failing fast. The jungle moon below him was his only chance, and he aimed for the thickest canopy he could find. As the ship began its death spiral, impact came hard and violent, throwing him against his restraints as metal shrieked and trees shattered beneath the falling craft. When silence finally settled over the wreckage, Minho found himself alive, but bleeding from a gash on his forehead. He spent the first hour assessing his situation, and it was not good at all. The ship would never fly again, and his long-range communications array had been completely destroyed in the crash. His emergency beacon was damaged but still functioning on minimal power, which meant rescue might come eventually if anyone was even looking for survivors from the convoy. He gathered what supplies he could salvage from the wreckage and took stock of his weapons, finding his pulse rifle still functional along with his sidearm and 4 extra power cells. Water was his immediate concern, and the humid jungle air told him there had to be streams or rivers somewhere nearby. Minho set out into the alien wilderness with his rifle ready and his senses on high alert. The jungle moon was beautiful in a dangerous way, with massive trees reaching toward the sky and strange flowers blooming in colors he had never seen before. He heard creatures moving through the undergrowth all around him, but nothing attacked him during those first few hours of exploration. He found a stream about 2 kilometers from his crash site and filled his canteens before deciding to explore a bit further. That was when he heard the sound that changed everything. It was a high-pitched cry, almost like a bird, but with a quality that seemed oddly familiar somehow. He followed the sound through dense vegetation until he came upon a hillside covered in thick vines. And there he found a burrow entrance partially hidden by leaves. The crying was coming from inside. Minho hesitated for a long moment because he knew he should walk away and mind his own business. But the cries were so desperate and so afraid that something deep inside him refused to leave without at least looking. He crouched down and peered into the burrow, and what he saw made his heart clench tight in his chest. 3 small creatures huddled together in the darkness, their soft fur matted and their large dark eyes filled with terror. They had 6 limbs each and rounded ears that lay flat against their heads in fear, and they could not have been larger than human infants. Minho recognized them immediately from his briefings, and the realization sent ice through his veins. These were Velorith young. The Velorith were one of the most powerful species in this sector of the galaxy, known for their fierce territorial nature and their deep suspicion of humans. Contact with them was strictly regulated through diplomatic channels, and unauthorized interaction with their kind could cause serious political problems. But these were babies. Alone and crying and clearly in distress, Minho looked around the burrow entrance and found signs that told him a story he did not like. There were tracks leading away from the burrow that belonged to an adult Velorith, probably the mother who had left to hunt for food. But there were also other tracks, larger and more numerous, belonging to something predatory that had been circling this area recently. The mother had been gone for a while. Based on how hungry and afraid the young ones seemed, something might have happened to her, or she might simply be delayed by the hunt. Either way, these babies were in danger, and they were completely helpless. Minho stood up and looked back toward his crash site, thinking about all the regulations he would be violating if he stayed here. He thought about the diplomatic incident this could cause and the court-martial he might face if anyone found out. Then he heard one of the young ones let out another frightened cry, and he stopped thinking about consequences altogether. He had grown up in an overcrowded colony station where resources were scarce and life was hard. His parents had died in a mining accident when he was 7 years old, and his grandmother had raised him and his 3 siblings alone. She had taught him many things during those difficult years, but the lesson that stuck with him most was simple: you do not abandon the helpless, no matter what it costs you. Minho moved to the burrow entrance and sat down with his back against the hillside, positioning himself so that nothing could get past him to reach the young inside. The babies went silent when they saw him settle into place, their dark eyes watching him with a mixture of fear and confusion. He did not try to touch them or enter their space because he knew that would only frighten them more. Instead, he simply sat there with his rifle across his knees, making it clear through his presence that he was not leaving. Hours passed slowly as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The jungle grew darker and the sounds of wildlife changed as nocturnal creatures began to stir. Minho ate a small portion of his emergency rations and drank sparingly from his canteen, knowing he needed to conserve his supplies behind him. He heard the young ones shifting around in their burrow, their small bodies pressing together for warmth and comfort. He wondered if their mother would return before nightfall, and he hoped desperately that she, a Velorith adult, would not be happy to find a human near her children. But at least then the young would be safe, and he could slip away before things got complicated. But nightfall came, and the mother did not appear. The jungle moon had no artificial lights, and the darkness that settled over the landscape was absolute and thick. Mayho activated the small light on his rifle and pointed it outward, creating a dim circle of visibility around the burrow entrance. That was when he heard something large moving through the undergrowth nearby. It was not trying to be quiet, which told him that whatever it was felt confident enough to not need stealth. He heard heavy breathing and the snap of branches as the creature circled closer. The young ones behind him began to whimper, and he knew they could sense the predator approaching. Minho raised his rifle and steadied his breathing as he waited for the threat to reveal itself. The creature that emerged from the darkness was massive, with 6 powerful legs and a mouth full of teeth that gleamed in his rifle light. It stood nearly 2 meters tall at the shoulder, and its eyes reflected the light with a hungry gleam. The predator had smelled blood from his head wound, and it had smelled the young ones in the burrow. It had come to feed. Minho did not hesitate and did not try to scare it away with warning shots. He aimed for the center of mass and opened fire.